Dear colleagues, this is a response to your Zoom meeting on June 25th, which you graciously allowed me to listen in on, but you wouldn't let me speak. Now I'm speaking. This video is part 1 of my response. Part 2 will follow. There will also be a version of both parts in Polish. In this first part, I'll try to explain why you should want to hear me, why you should value my advice, and I'll try to show you how you've been misled, misinformed, deceived, by right-wing propaganda and by a malicious story that you have uncritically believed and won't give me a chance to correct. In part 2, I'll comment on your presentation and make a proposal for further discussion. To begin with, I'd like to stress that I'm not Polish. I owe my knowledge of Polish to my mother, a Holocaust survivor from Warsaw, but I've never lived in Poland, and I don't take part in your political disputes because it's not my business. If I were a Polish citizen, I'd probably vote for the SLD, exactly the opposite of the political posture that you attribute to me. In fact, everything that you think you know about me and about my book is similarly not just untrue, but the exact opposite of the truth. As I'll explain, you have allowed yourselves to be deceived, to be deluded by a skilled con man, a real artist. I'm not a Polish historian who relatively recently became interested in the Holocaust, and then only in Poland, and only within the bounds of a controversy that isn't a controversy anywhere except in Poland. I'm a Holocaust historian, active in the field since 1985 and professionally since 1994, much longer than most of you, with many notable achievements that you seem to know nothing about. You, the Centrum, represent one side of that non-controversy. On the other side, you have people like Chodakiewicz, Gontarczyk, Ewa Kurek-Lesik, Leszek Żebrowski, Jerzy Robert-Nowak, propagandists who distort history to serve their political agenda. They embrace me and wave my book around as if it justifies them, which it most certainly does not. But you assume that they're telling the truth, you believe them, and you figure that I must be one of them. But think for a moment. If I'm one of them, why don't they invite me to speak? Why have I myself never said anything on their side? Quite the opposite. Read my review of Sąsiedzi Polin in 2006. It will open your eyes. The right is what it is, and you know well how they exploit anything they can for their propaganda. The entire attraction of my book for them is that it's an award-winning book put out by prestigious publishers, Yale University Press and Znak in Kraków, by a Jewish author who now and then says something they can twist for their purpose. But they don't want to hear from me because I'll untwist their words and spoil their little party. But what about you? Why do you shut me out? Whether you know it or not, you've been infected by a malicious virus injected into the academic bloodstream 16 years ago in the Slavic Review by a man named Leo Cooper. Cooper, seeing that the right apparently finds my book useful, decided that it was his duty to discredit it, and he was just the man for the job. From what we know of him, Cooper was born in Poland around 1922. When the war broke out, he fled to the Soviet Union and lived there for some time under Stalin. Eventually he found his way to Australia, where he became a Sovietologist. So he's an expert on the Soviet Union, but not on Poland, and certainly not on the Holocaust. While he was in the Soviet Union, he mastered the art of the Stalinist denunciation, and his so-called review is a pure example of the type. A real professional job, a masterpiece of its kind. For example, in Chapter 3, I discussed the conditions that Jews faced after they escaped from the ghetto. In some ways, worse than those they had left behind. A few numbers make the point. 30% of the Jews died in the ghetto. Of those who escaped, 60% died, compared with 20% of the Polish population. So Jewish mortality was twice as high on the Aryan side as in the ghetto, and 3 times as high as that of the Polish population. So yes, conditions on the Aryan side were in some ways worse, more dangerous than in the ghetto, for the Jews who escaped. But Cooper leaves out the tiny little detail that I'm writing about the Jews, and creates the impression that I'm comparing life for the Poles on the Aryan side with life for the Jews in the ghetto, with a view to proving that the Jews were not singled out for persecution, but that the Poles suffered just as much, if not more. In other words, that the Holocaust is greatly exaggerated or never happened. So with a few deft strokes, leaving out a few words, Cooper turns a social history of a Jewish community, which my book is, into the work of a Holocaust denier. And that's how it's done. And you should know how it's done. For example, that's how a Stalinist court made Kazimierz Moczarski out to be a German agent. When you twist words like that, you can make anything mean anything. The whole review is disinformation, an intricately woven tapestry of lies, so extreme, so outrageous, that it's impossible to believe he had the audacity to make it all up. And that's how disinformation works, and why it is so devastatingly effective. Few of you have ever heard of Cooper, I'm sure, and even fewer have read his review, but disinformation is designed to spread virally, and you have all been infected. Cooper's lies are so outrageous, so far the opposite of the truth, that it's easy to tell whether someone gets their ideas from reading my book or directly or indirectly from Cooper. And everything I hear coming out of Poland is either right-wing propaganda or variations on themes by Cooper. Your contempt for me is a symptom of the Cooper disease, exactly what he aimed to achieve. Let's hear from a more competent reviewer. David Engel wrote that my book would richly repay a careful reading, fostering subtle and sophisticated thinking about formidable historical problems. But in the polarized atmosphere that has existed in Poland for the last 20 years, no one reads carefully. There's no room for subtle or sophisticated thinking, or for recognition of any formidable problems. Everything is tribal, black and white, simplistic. Polish discourse has descended to the level of a street brawl. No one can be taken seriously who would form their ideas about an award-winning book by a recognized Holocaust scholar on the basis of what they have heard about it, without reading it carefully or at all. You may have impressive credentials in your own fields, but you're not experts in mine, you're not experts on the Holocaust, and certainly not on the subject that my book deals with. In fact, you haven't even figured out what that subject is. Your credulity, your carelessness, and your ill-conceived prejudice all show that you are amateurs, dilettantes. That's why you're vulnerable to this stuff. You've just recently taken an interest in a subject that I've been writing, researching, and thinking about for 35 years, and in a way all my life. You should welcome the opportunity to talk to me, to discuss your work with a real expert. Instead, you fend me off with crosses and garlic like superstitious peasants. In 2015, after many years of litigation, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice issued a judgment against Cooper, declaring his review to be defamatory and awarding more than 200,000 Canadian dollars in damages and costs. As you know, in the following year, the owner of the website Fronda.pl was convicted of criminal libel for misrepresenting Grabowski's book Judenjagd. And quite right, too. There's no point in discussing anything with such people. They have to be exposed and discredited. And Cooper also stands discredited by a court judgment. And you must not repeat any part or any form of it explicitly or implicitly. So you have to hear me, so that you know what's fact and what's fiction, what's true and what's false. Otherwise, you lay yourselves open to the possibility of criminal prosecution. But it shouldn't take the threat of legal action. You should welcome the opportunity to discuss your research with a more experienced colleague, recognized everywhere except in Poland as an expert on the Holocaust, and the author of the definitive work on your subject. You have no legitimate reason to exclude me, and you have every reason to want to hear me, to discuss our common line of research. Cooper's virus has caused enormous damage to me, to you, to the progress of scholarship, and now to this museum. If nothing is done, a misguided plan based on irrational beliefs will become set in stone for the ages. So it's not a game anymore. It's a matter of public international importance. So you have a choice. You can hold on blindly to your beliefs and see an important project ruined, or you can listen to reason. It's up to you. Okay, that's it for part 1. In part 2, I'll comment on your Zoom presentation and propose further discussion. Please share a link to this video because it's important, and please comment below so that we can at last start to have a real civilized conversation. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.